Hello, this is a supplemental podcast for, primarily for heresy and dissent, but some of these ideas apply equally well to contemporary Christianity, and some of the third year students doing dissertations might well be able to use some of these ideas in their dissertation, depending on quite the subject of your dissertation. This is looking at the idea of the transition from oral culture to manuscript culture, to print culture, and into where we are in the 21st century electronic culture. One day, 100, 500 years time, there might be another thing added on to the end of that, but at the moment electronic is the current one. These ideas were developed by researchers like Marshall McLuhan and Elizabeth Eisenstein, various other people. Their argument has been that the transmission of knowledge involves a culture, and different periods of history tend to be dominated by particular types of technology. If we can, it's not quite the right word, but we'll stick with that for the moment. Technology for transmitting knowledge and information. So in ancient times, if we go back, well, I was going to say a couple of thousand years, but actually we don't even have to go anywhere near that far back. Most knowledge was transmitted orally, which is to say that the vast majority of people could not read and could not write. In some cultures, in Egypt, Greece, Rome, etc., there were priests and highly educated specialists, usually from fairly wealthy backgrounds, who could read and write, who acted as scribes, but the vast majority of people who worked in the fields or were fishermen or whatever couldn't. Those people had what is termed these days an oral culture. We still have an oral culture. If you're sitting on the bus or the train chatting to the person next to you, you are engaging in oral culture. It's just speaking. If you're just chatting about the weather or something, it's not desperately important. But the idea is that if you're transmitting knowledge, the history of your tribe, the history of your nation, how to create a healing ointment to put on a wound, where the best hunting grounds are, which part of the river is best to fish in, which plants are safe to eat, which plants are dangerous. All of that in an oral culture has to be done by the spoken word, which could be parents and grandparents telling their kids and their grandkids. It could be the wise old man or the wise old woman in the village sitting round with a whole group of, not just children, it could be people of any age, sitting listening to what they have to say. As you'll all know from your own experience, unless you have one of those photographic memories, people can tell you all sorts of things and half an hour later you've totally forgotten what they said. If the transmission of knowledge is dependent on the vagaries of human memory, then something really important, like don't eat this plant, it's poisonous. If you've forgotten that within half an hour, chances are you're going to eat the plant the next day and die. So some forms of knowledge become terrifically important. Other things, gossip about who's sleeping with who or whatever, if you forget it, you forget it. Maybe it's not all that important. But other forms of information are very, very important to know. And therefore, if you're teaching orally, you have to do it in a certain way. Those of you who are of a certain age may remember primary school classes and that kind of thing, where you had to learn times tables by rote, just repeating and repeating and repeating until your brain probably felt like it was dripping out of its ears. That kind of a style, even though all of us are living in the print generation, let alone the electronic generation, where a teacher no doubt wrote things on the blackboard or whatever, depending on how old you are, as to what style of technology they used. Most of it you would have learned orally. That kind of repetition process is a common feature of a lot of oral cultures, in which important information isn't told to you just the once. They tell it to you many times, and they get you to repeat it back and repeat it back and repeat it back until they're sure that you can remember not to eat that particular plant or whatever it might be. And the same is true not just of the transmission of dietary information or how to build a boat or something like that, but also of religious law, who the gods are, who the ancestors are, how to conduct a ceremony, how to perform a marriage or a funeral or whatever it might be. All of those kinds of information are transmitted orally. And if you think of a culture in which virtually everyone is illiterate and is reliant on memory, imagine you were trying to do your degree and you weren't allowed to take notes, and the teacher wasn't allowed to write anything on the screen or the blackboard, whiteboard as it is at college. It just had to rely on the teacher remembering everything, telling you, and then you remembering everything, because you had no means to write it down. It would be a phenomenal challenge. It's quite frightening enough when you are allowed to write things down, let alone when if you're in a situation where you weren't allowed to, or weren't able rather, to do that. So there are cultures in which people have phenomenal memories. There's been research, for example, with the Navajo, who use memory techniques which enable, well, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them to remember far more information than your average American, non-Navajo American would think it is humanly possible. Cultures which have a strong oral tradition often use things like rhyme and rhythm and song, poetry, things like that, as a way of storing information, because it's easier to remember things in rhyme, for example. That's oral culture, to a point. Manuscript culture is the advent of writing. Now, although it's called manuscript, and a manuscript is generally either paper or vellum, animal skin, it does include things like ancient Egyptians writing on walls, or the ancient Sumerians writing cuneiform on pottery. So it's not just paper-based, it's any form of handwriting, whether that's with a pen and ink, or whether that's with a chisel and a hammer on the walls, or however you're going to do it, where a person has to sit there and write the thing out. And if you want a copy, you can't just press a button on a computer and it churns out 1,000 copies. You've got to do all 1,000 copies yourself. That's manuscript culture. There is a transition, not just in how people do it, in that people have got to, first off, develop an alphabet, then teach everyone else what that alphabet is, and they've got to work out, this sign is an S sound, and that sign is an U sound, and that's how do we pronounce a word right? We're going to use this symbol and this symbol and this symbol and this symbol. That will represent the word elephant, and do it that way. So it's not only dreaming up the symbols and teaching the symbols, but it's inventing ink, inventing manuscript, working out that if you've got a metal chisel and a hammer, you can bang things into stone, but if you've got a wooden chisel and a hammer, it won't go into stone. Those sorts of practical methods of how are we actually going to commit this to writing. More than that, manuscript culture opens up new possibilities. If you've got an oral culture, I can remember my granddad telling me this. My sister remembers granddad telling her the same thing but in a slightly different way. So it's my memory and her memory, and we're debating, is it this, is it that? There is an element of almost fluidity about the idea of truth, in that we are, all of us in our tribe, aware that sometimes we can remember things in a slightly inaccurate way. And perhaps therefore we are more flexible about what we consider to be the truth with a capital T. When we get to manuscript culture, I've written something down. I can pass that page to some other scribe who can sit there with a fresh bit of paper and copy it out letter for letter. That could be done 1,000 times over. And in theory, I know sometimes a scribe has had a bit too much to drink, or they're half asleep, or whatever, and they make a mistake in transcribing the information. So there is still some flexibility, room for the odd spelling mistake, that sort of thing. But generally speaking, a copied page, if you've got 2 pages, the original and the copied one, they are 99% the same thing. And therefore the notion of, I remember my granddad telling me this, I've written it down, you've copied it out 1,000 times over, those 1,000 copies are all going to say the same thing, essentially. There's more of a notion of truth being a fixed phenomenon. When we're approaching ideas of religion, and you could apply this to ethics as well, and the discussion of non-religious philosophies, the great thinker, the great guru or philosopher or whoever it is has said this. We have written it down. It becomes fixed. At the point where it hits a page or is being chiselled into a wall,